Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, better known as the Queen Mother, cultivated an image of warmth, grace, and unwavering devotion to the British monarchy throughout her long life. Her public persona as the smiling Duchess, and later as the beloved Queen Mother, masked a more complex and often controversial figure whose actions and attitudes occasionally contradicted her carefully crafted public image. This video will delve into the lesser-known aspects of her life, revealing the scandals and controversies that lay beneath her perpetual smile. Born into aristocracy in 1900, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's early life offered glimpses of the strong-willed and particular personality that would later define her royal career. Even as a young child, she displayed a remarkable awareness of social hierarchy and proper address. A telling incident occurred when, after falling, she sharply corrected a concerned passerby who called her dearie, insisting on being addressed as ma'am, a title she would maintain throughout her life with notable precision, even correcting those who didn't pronounce it properly, to rhyme with spam, not harm. This early insistence on protocol and status would evolve into a more complex pattern of behavior that sometimes manifested as classism and prejudice. Her upbringing in the privileged environment of British aristocracy shaped her worldview in ways that would later prove problematic in an increasingly democratic and egalitarian society. While history often portrays her marriage to the future King George VI as a romantic triumph, the reality was far more complicated. Elizabeth initially rejected Prince Albert's proposals twice, partly due to his pronounced shyness and awkwardness, which she found unappealing. More significantly, she dreaded the loss of personal freedom that would come with royal life, expressing fears about never being able to think, speak, and act as she believed she ought to. During this period of courtship, evidence suggests she engaged in flirtatious interactions with James Stuart, the prince's aide, and may have had some interest in the Prince of Wales, Edward. These romantic entanglements, while perhaps minor in themselves, hint at a woman who was strategic in her romantic choices and aware of the power dynamics at play in royal circles. One of the most significant scandals in Elizabeth's life centered around her treatment of Wallis Simpson and the former King Edward VIII. When Edward abdicated to marry Simpson, Elizabeth's reaction went beyond mere disapproval. She demonstrated a remarkable capacity for grudge-holding and social manipulation, consistently referring to Simpson as that woman and refusing to grant her the title Her Royal Highness, even after her marriage to Edward. The depth of her animosity became particularly apparent during a visit to Balmoral Castle, where she publicly snubbed Simpson with the cutting remark, "I came to dine with the king." This wasn't merely a matter of protocol. It was a calculated social slight that set the tone for decades of exclusion and hostility. Later, when King George VI died, Elizabeth's bitterness reached a new peak. She blamed Edward and Wallis for her husband's premature death, convinced that the stress of unexpected kingship had shortened his life. In perhaps her coldest act, she denied Edward entry to his own brother's funeral, a decision that shocked many and revealed the extent of her capacity for revenge. Perhaps the most disturbing scandal in Elizabeth's life concerned the treatment of her nieces, Catherine and Nerissa Bowes-Lyon. In 1987, it was revealed that these two women, long reported as deceased, were actually alive and had been institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital. The women, who had learning disabilities rather than mental illness, had been effectively abandoned by their family, including Elizabeth. The Queen Mother's response to this revelation was particularly telling. Rather than expressing remorse or taking responsibility, she denied any knowledge of the situation. More disturbingly, her primary concern seemed to be ensuring that everyone knew the madness didn't come from her side of the family. This incident revealed a troubling attitude toward disability and family responsibility, as well as a tendency to prioritize image over compassion. Elizabeth's personal habits often crossed the line from luxury into excess. By 1998, she had accumulated an astonishing £4 million overdraft at her bank, a scandal that made headlines. Her response to this revelation was characteristic. She attended the races the very day the news broke, displaying a remarkable indifference to public opinion regarding her spending habits. Her daily alcohol consumption was notably excessive, following a strict schedule that included Dubonnet at noon, red wine at lunch, port and martini at supper, and 2 glasses of champagne during dinner. While this might have been dismissed as a charming eccentricity in a less public figure, it raised eyebrows given her position and responsibilities. Throughout her life, Elizabeth displayed attitudes that reflected the prejudices of her era and class, but were nonetheless troubling. She opposed democratic elections in India and supported white supremacist rule in Rhodesia. Her behavior toward those she considered lesser folk was often dismissive or openly hostile. A particularly shocking incident occurred during a reception for a Japanese prince, where she reportedly walked in loudly proclaiming Nippon to his face. Such behavior wasn't merely a product of her times. It represented a conscious choice to maintain prejudices even as society around her changed. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon maintained extensive private correspondence during World War II that revealed a different side to her public wartime persona. While she was praised for staying in London during the Blitz, her private letters showed she harbored deep resentment towards certain political figures who advocated for peace negotiations with Germany. She actively worked behind the scenes to influence military decisions and diplomatic relations, often bypassing proper governmental channels through her personal connections. Her letters to Winston Churchill, only partially released decades later, revealed she pushed for more aggressive bombing campaigns against German civilian targets, contrasting sharply with her public image as a compassionate figure. She also maintained correspondence with several aristocratic families in Nazi-occupied territories, raising questions about divided loyalties among the European nobility during wartime. The Queen Mother's treatment of her household staff revealed a pattern of capricious behavior and harsh demands. She maintained an enormous staff even during times of national austerity, insisting on old-world service standards that many considered excessive. However, what truly raised eyebrows was the high turnover rate among her personal staff and the strict non-disclosure agreements they were required to sign. Several former employees attempted to publish memoirs or speak about their experiences, only to face aggressive legal action from the palace. There were persistent rumors about staff members who suddenly disappeared from service after witnessing or experiencing troubling incidents. The palace's official explanation was always that they had retired or moved on to other opportunities, but former colleagues often told different stories. Elizabeth's beloved Scottish estate, the Castle of May, served as more than just a summer retreat. The remote castle became a center of intrigue and clandestine meetings, particularly during the 1960s and 1970s. Local residents reported strange comings and goings, with private aircraft landing at unusual hours and unscheduled visits from prominent political figures who were never officially recorded in the castle's guest books. The castle's extensive renovation, funded through mysterious channels, raised questions about financial impropriety. More concerning were the reports of documents being regularly burned in the castle grounds, particularly after sensitive political events or royal family controversies. The Queen Mother maintained tight control over access to certain areas of the castle, with even family members restricted from entering specific rooms. Throughout her life, Elizabeth amassed an extensive private art collection, much of which remained unregistered and away from public view. Several significant pieces that had been reported lost during World War II mysteriously appeared in her private quarters decades later. Questions about the provenance of certain artworks, particularly those acquired during the immediate post-war period, were never satisfactorily answered. More troubling were the allegations that some pieces in her collection had questionable origins, possibly having been appropriated during the war years or acquired through unofficial channels. After her death, several pieces disappeared entirely, their current whereabouts unknown. The palace's refusal to provide a complete inventory of her art collection only fueled speculation about its true extent and value. Elizabeth's health issues were carefully managed and often concealed from public knowledge. Her medical records, partially released years after her death, revealed several serious conditions that were successfully hidden from the public eye. More significantly, they showed a pattern of using her influence to access experimental treatments and medications not available to the general public. The Queen Mother maintained a personal medical team sworn to absolute secrecy, with several doctors losing their licenses after attempting to discuss her care. There were also troubling indications that she used her position to influence medical research funding, directing resources toward conditions that affected her while neglecting other public health priorities. While much has been made of Elizabeth's notorious bank overdraft, less attention has been paid to her sophisticated investment strategy and offshore financial arrangements. Documents suggest she maintained substantial investments in controversial industries, including South African diamond mines during apartheid and various enterprises that would have embarrassed the royal family had they become public knowledge. Her financial advisors operated through a complex network of shell companies and trusts, making it nearly impossible to trace the full extent of her wealth. Despite living through periods of significant economic hardship in Britain, her personal lifestyle never showed signs of austerity. Questions about how she maintained such extravagant spending habits despite her official income remain unanswered. These investments extended beyond mere financial concerns. They represented a web of influence and power that she carefully maintained throughout her life. Her financial dealings often intersected with political interests, creating potential conflicts of interest that were never fully examined during her lifetime. The true extent of Elizabeth's wealth remains unknown, as many of her financial records were either destroyed or sealed under long-term privacy agreements. What is clear is that her financial activities went far beyond the typical royal investment portfolio, involving complex international transactions and partnerships that raised serious ethical questions. Behind the Queen Mother's gracious smiles lay a determined defender of British colonial interests. Her influence in colonial affairs went far beyond ceremonial duties, extending into active interference with independence movements across the empire. Private correspondence reveals her deep involvement in attempting to maintain British control over various territories, particularly in Africa and Asia. During India's push for independence, Elizabeth worked behind the scenes to delay the process, viewing Gandhi's movement with particular disdain. She maintained close relationships with hardline colonial administrators and frequently lobbied against reforms that would grant greater autonomy to colonial subjects. Her support for white minority rule in Rhodesia wasn't merely passive. She actively used her influence to support Ian Smith's regime through unofficial channels. The Queen Mother's colonial attitudes manifested in her personal life as well. Her household staff was strictly segregated, with non-white servants relegated to specific roles and kept away from public-facing positions. When entertaining colonial dignitaries, she insisted on elaborate protocols that emphasized British superiority, often causing diplomatic embarrassment that had to be smoothed over by government officials. Her private communications with colonial governors revealed a woman determined to maintain the racial hierarchies of empire, even as the world changed around her. She viewed independence movements not as legitimate aspirations for self-determination, but as direct threats to British prestige and her family's position. This worldview influenced royal policy toward former colonies well into the modern era. Elizabeth wielded extraordinary influence over British high society, using her position to make and break reputations at will. She maintained an elaborate network of informants who kept her updated on social gossip, scandals, and potential threats to the royal family's interests. Her famous evening salons were more than social gatherings. They were carefully orchestrated events where careers were made or destroyed over cocktails and witty conversation. The Queen Mother maintained what became known as her Black Books, detailed records of social transgressions, family secrets, and potential scandals involving prominent families. These records proved invaluable in maintaining control over Britain's upper classes, ensuring their continued loyalty to the crown through subtle manipulation and occasional threats of exposure. Her influence extended to marriage arrangements among the aristocracy. She actively intervened to prevent unions she considered unsuitable, whether due to background, politics, or potential scandal. Several prominent marriages of the period were quietly arranged or derailed based on her preferences, though her involvement was carefully concealed. The extent of her social engineering became apparent only after her death, when various society figures began sharing stories of how their lives had been shaped by her invisible hand. From political appointments to business dealings, her influence touched virtually every aspect of upper-class British life, creating a web of obligation and favor that strengthened the monarchy's position. Long before modern public relations, Elizabeth was a master at media manipulation. She cultivated personal relationships with newspaper editors and influential journalists, ensuring favorable coverage of royal activities while suppressing negative stories. Her methods ranged from exclusive access and strategic leaks to more heavy-handed approaches when necessary. She established a sophisticated system for monitoring press coverage, with a team dedicated to tracking and responding to potential threats to the royal image. Journalists who crossed her often found their careers stalled or their access to important sources suddenly limited. Conversely, those who cooperated were rewarded with exclusive stories and social advancement. The Queen Mother's media strategy extended to photography, and film. She understood the power of visual imagery long before it became common practice, carefully controlling which photographs were released and how they were presented. She insisted on specific camera angles and lighting arrangements that would present her in the most flattering way possible, even in her later years. Perhaps most significantly, she orchestrated many seemingly spontaneous moments that became part of royal lore. The famous story of her refusing to leave London during the Blitz was carefully staged and promoted, though the reality of her wartime experience was more complex. She would often have events and interactions choreographed in advance, then presented as natural occurrences to the press. Her influence on royal media relations created protocols and practices that continue to shape how the monarchy interacts with the press today. Many of the techniques she pioneered, from strategic leaks to careful image management, remain standard practice in royal communications. These aspects of Elizabeth's life reveal a woman who understood power in all its forms: social, political, and psychological. Her ability to operate behind the scenes while maintaining a beloved public image speaks to her remarkable skill in managing public perception and wielding influence. The effects of her actions continue to influence the British monarchy and society. The system she put in place for managing information, controlling social networks, and maintaining royal influence adapted to modern times, but retained their essential character. Her understanding of how to balance public adoration with private power helped ensure the monarchy's survival through rapidly changing times. As more historical records become available and those who knew her feel free to speak, our understanding of Elizabeth's methods and influence continues to grow. The picture that emerges is of a far more complex and calculated figure than her public image suggested, a woman who shaped 20th century Britain through subtle manipulation and careful control of information and social networks. The true extent of her influence may never be fully known, as many records were destroyed or sealed upon her death. However, the patterns of behavior and control she established continue to echo through British society and the monarchy, shaping how power is exercised and maintained in ways that are only now beginning to be understood. These hidden chapters in Elizabeth's life paint a picture of a woman who was far more calculating and influential than her public image suggested. Her ability to maintain multiple facades, the smiling public figure, the behind-the-scenes power broker, and the keeper of dark secrets, speaks to both her complexity as an individual and the sophisticated machinery of royal image management. The effects of her actions continue to reverberate through the royal family and British society today. Many of the precedents she set for managing royal scandal and controlling information flow remain in place, while the full extent of her influence on current royal protocols and practices is still being uncovered. Modern historians and researchers continue to uncover new aspects of Elizabeth's life and influence, suggesting that even these revelations may only scratch the surface of her true impact on 20th century British history. As more documents become declassified and more witnesses feel free to speak, our understanding of this complex and controversial figure continues to evolve. Elizabeth's relationship with Princess Diana represented perhaps her most public failure to adapt to changing times. She developed an intense aversion to Diana and her modernizing influence on the monarchy. While she outwardly maintained decorum, she made her disapproval known through subtle but effective means. Her comment that Diana ought to have known better, despite her youth, revealed a fundamental lack of empathy and understanding for the challenges faced by a young woman in Diana's position. The Queen Mother's steadfast support of traditional royal protocols and resistance to change contributed to the isolation Diana experienced within the royal family. Elizabeth's mastery of public relations was perhaps her greatest achievement and her greatest deception. Known as the Smiling Duchess and later as the beloved Queen Mother, she carefully cultivated an image of warmth and accessibility while maintaining rigid control over how she was perceived. Her insistence on being carried by helicopter rather than being seen in a wheelchair in her later years exemplified this preoccupation with image. Even at her husband's funeral, where she famously shed no tears, she prioritized maintaining her public persona as the unwavering pillar of British strength over displaying genuine emotion. While Elizabeth's wartime role is often celebrated, even this period of her life wasn't without controversy. Her visits to bomb-damaged areas of London while wearing her finest clothes and jewelry created resentment among East End residents who had lost everything. Her famous quote about being glad Buckingham Palace was bombed so she could look the East End in the face revealed a concerning disconnect from the reality of wartime suffering. Moreover, there were troubling reports about her attitude toward Jews and her initial support for appeasing Hitler, details that have been largely overshadowed by her later wartime popularity. Throughout her life, Elizabeth wielded considerable influence over the monarchy, often in ways that weren't immediately apparent to the public. Her insistence on being titled Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother after her husband's death wasn't merely about avoiding confusion. It was about maintaining her status and influence within the royal hierarchy. She continued to shape royal policy and attitudes well into her daughter's reign, often advocating for more traditional and conservative approaches to monarchy. Her influence extended to matters of succession, family relationships, and the public presentation of the royal family. Elizabeth's treatment of family members who didn't meet her standards was consistently harsh. Beyond her famous feuds with Edward and Wallis Simpson, she showed little interest in her nephew Timothy, who struggled with alcoholism. She never visited him and didn't attend his wife's funeral, even after their child, her great-niece, died. These personal vendettas and selective familial relationships revealed a woman who, despite her public image of warmth and family devotion, could be remarkably cold and unforgiving when it suited her purposes. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon's life spanned over a century and witnessed tremendous changes in British society and the monarchy. While her public image as the beloved Queen Mother endures, a closer examination reveals a more complex and often contradictory figure. Her prejudices, grudges, and carefully maintained public persona all contributed to a legacy that deserves closer scrutiny. The scandals and controversies that marked her life don't necessarily diminish her historical importance or her contributions to the British monarchy, but they do provide a more complete and nuanced picture of a woman who was far more complex than her public image suggested. Her story serves as a reminder that historical figures are rarely as simple as their public personas might suggest, and that power, privilege, and personality can combine to create complicated legacies that deserve careful examination. The Queen Mother's life demonstrates how public image and private reality can diverge significantly, and how the careful management of public perception can shape historical memory. As we continue to examine and understand her legacy, these lesser-known aspects of her life provide valuable insight into both the woman herself and the institution she helped to shape and preserve. Her story remains relevant today as the British monarchy continues to navigate the challenges of tradition versus modernization, public scrutiny versus private life. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you're fascinated by tales of political intrigue and ambition, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell for more captivating historical stories.